Marty Baron needs no introduction, but I will introduce him anyway. He started his career in journalism at the Miami Herald in his native Florida, moved to the Los Angeles Times for many years, then to the New York Times, back to the Herald as editor, and on to the Boston Globe in 2001. His last job was as executive editor of the Washington Post, where he kept Trump and company on the defensive with a steady stream of investigative coups. During his tenure at the Globe and the Post, the papers pulled in a dozen Pulitzer Prizes for a variety of investigative projects. The most famous, of course, was the Globe's probe of sexual abuse by Roman Catholic priests. The newspaper series was adapted to the film Spotlight, which not only won the Academy Award as Best Picture, but more importantly, inspired probes of clergy abuse across the United States and around the world. David Margolick and I are going to share the job of interrogator. I will go first. Marty, tell us some of the ways in which Donald Trump tortured your reporters and editors at the Washington Post during the last 4 years.
Obviously, he attacked people regularly. He attacked some people by name, which was the most horrifying, subjecting them to harassment online and in phone calls and voicemails and elsewhere. He incited his crowds, the crowds at his rallies, against reporters, and they felt that. I mean, during his initial campaign, he had actually barred us from his rallies, from being credentialed to cover the rallies for many months. It kind of went on from there. At the same time, he made himself remarkably accessible. When we did our book, Trump Revealed, during the campaign, he gave 20 hours of interviews to two reporters. And that was pretty remarkable, even as he was banning our reporters from being credentialed to cover his campaign.
Did you ever have personal contact with him?
Yeah, I had some personal contact, and he made a couple of phone calls to complain about stories. So, yeah.
You weren't able to persuade him to stop, I gather.
He's unstoppable. I don't think he's subject to persuasion on that. I mean, look, we were a convenient enemy. He always needed an enemy. Otherwise, you just judge him on his own merits. I think he always felt it was helpful to have an enemy. If he didn't have somebody in the world of politics or government or the private sector or wherever it was, he always had the press available to him. And it was very popular with his base. And he knew that, and he was going to take advantage of that.
How much damage do you think that he and his regime did to the profession of journalism? Do you really think he believed in his fake news?
It's hard to tell. I mean, it's hard to tell what he really believes and what he just says for political reasons sometimes. I think he's somewhat, he's come across as somewhat self-delusional. So to some extent, I think he's convinced himself that it's fake. But he also finds it very advantageous. It's useful for him politically. And so he does it. He does what is advantageous for him politically. I don't think that he has ever operated very much on core principle, and he does what serves his own interests the most.
He has inspired politicians around the world to cry fake news whenever negative reporting is done about him. Probably Pew has done research, but probably the media is less credible now than it was 5 years ago to the normal citizen.
I think that's true. I think it's one of the great successes that he's had. Maybe not great, but one of the big successes he's had, at least what he would count as a success, and that is undermining the credibility of the press. I think he did have an impact in that way, and in many ways that might be his single biggest achievement, if you can call it that. Certainly among Republicans, trust in the press has dropped dramatically. Among Democrats, it actually rose, and it's risen a little bit as a result of that and an increase among independents. But he set out as an objective right from the very beginning to demolish the credibility of the press. He said he wanted to do that so that people wouldn't believe anything that we wrote that was critical about him. He said that in an interview with Leslie Stahl early on. And that's what he is. That's what he's done. You know, he's often quite transparent about what he's trying to do and why he's trying to do it.
I could follow up on that. I mean, I'm just curious about why you think he cooperated with Post reporters if he was so dead set against the Post. What do you make of that contradiction?
You know, he's been talking to reporters since that he slammed as well. I mean, I think that he likes to be covered. I think he thinks that he can persuade people, he can charm them or what have you. I think he deludes himself into thinking that. I mean, why did he talk to Bob Woodward for his book? He didn't talk to him for his first book, but he talked to him for his second book, and then somehow was surprised that it was critical. I think he assumed that somehow he would persuade Bob that he was doing a great job or something like that. God knows. But I think he's absorbed with himself. I mean, there's no question about it. And, you know, there is a narcissism there, and he likes to be covered. And so I think what he did for the rallies was, you know, just a way of punishing us. But he still wanted to see, he knew that we were doing a book on him, and he wanted to do his best, I guess, to try to persuade us that, you know, that he was what he thinks he is. I mean, I guess, I don't know exactly what's going around in his head.
I have a few extra questions of my own, but let's just to stick with this. And I think Michael and I want to open this up and let other people ask questions on their own and unmute themselves. But I'll preempt this with Ralph Blumenthal writes, I mean, do you think that just as a matter of the bottom line, that Donald Trump was good for journalism and good for the Washington Post and good for your regime in a way?
Well, I mean, that's a complicated question. I mean, I don't think he's good for journalism. I think that he has undermined confidence in our profession. In that way, I don't think he's been good for journalism. And, you know, without the confidence of the public, we have great difficulty. And I think he's undermined the concept of objective reality and truth. And that's even more serious, not as just an issue for the press, but it's an issue for society as a whole and for democracy. On the other hand, I think that he has, his presence has actually driven home to journalists about what their obligations are when they come under pressure like this. I think that it is, in that way, it's had a beneficial effect on journalism of reminding us of our core mission and pushing us to be more, I would say, more unflinching in our coverage and more straightforward in our coverage. What was the other elements about?
Well, the question about whether it was actually good for the Post and good for your regime at the Post.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, yeah, I mean, if you look at it that way, I mean, I think that it certainly had a beneficial economic effect on the Post. A lot of people subscribed to the Post as a result of him being in the presidency, there was a strong feeling that he needed to be held accountable. They felt that we and other news organizations, including the New York Times, were doing a good job of that. They wanted to support it. They no longer took the press for granted as they had in the past. They were concerned about the weakness of other institutions in American society, Congress, the courts, and there was a real question as to who's going to hold this guy accountable. And they saw the press as perhaps the last institution that was going to do that, and so they felt they needed to support it. So Post was a beneficiary of that, of course, by attracting a large number of digital subscribers. Obviously, I think I benefited to some degree because people saw that we were going to do our job as journalists and that we were going to do it well and that we weren't going to be intimidated by a person who was arguably the most powerful person on earth. So to the extent that so maybe I derived some benefits from that, yes.
Could you talk a little bit, Marty, about Jeff Bezos, your relationship with him, how often you heard from him, what kind of steward you think he is of the Washington Post, and whether ownership by people like him is sort of a model for journalism going forward and newspaper journalism going forward?
Well, I think he's been a great steward of the Washington Post. He changed our strategy and it needed to be changed. We, up till that point, were focusing on our region. We were, as they put it at the time, for and about Washington. He saw that there was really no model at the time for local journalism, or not one that he could envision. But there was an opportunity for the Washington Post to be a national and even international news organization. That we, as he told us, we had suffered all the pain that the internet had to offer. It destroyed all the pillars of our financial model, but that it had also given us a gift, and we hadn't taken advantage of that gift. And that gift was national and worldwide distribution at very little additional cost. And then we were positioned to take advantage of that because we were based in Washington. It's a good place for a national publication. Because we had the name, the Washington Post, which is a name that can be leveraged to a national and even international level. And because we had a history and tradition of, as he liked to put it, shining a light in dark corners, going back to Watergate, and that, that had established an identity for the Washington Post, even among people who had never read the Washington Post. And so that was a plus for us. And the implication being we didn't have to go off to a retreat to figure out who we were. We knew who we were. So he recognized that opportunity and was willing to invest in us with that opportunity in mind, as long as we were doing things that he felt would capitalize on the digital opportunity. And so he funded that. He funded a wide range of initiatives at the beginning. Since then, we've been, profitable. I mean, we've been able to reinvest the profits that we have. He's allowed us to do that. Obviously, he doesn't need the dividends, and so we've been able to continue to invest and to grow. And look, we started when he came on board. We had about 580 people in our newsroom, and now the Post will be at the end of this year will be at 1,010. At least. So that's pretty good. So I do think he's been a good steward. He hasn't interfered in any of our journalism in terms of telling us what to cover or how to cover it, or including coverage of himself. He has never quashed a story. He's never suggested a story or anything like that. So, and that, as I said, that includes coverage of him, includes coverage of Amazon, and there's been plenty of that, and there've been plenty critical stories in the Post, and he's never once said anything to me about any of that. He has given us our full independence and has respected our integrity as journalists, and I think he will continue to do so.
How often, day to day, week to week, month to month, would you interact with him? And if you were writing a story about him based on your experiences with him during your tenure or regime, what would the lead be? What did you learn about him?
The interactions they shifted over time. I mean, at the beginning, they were fairly frequent. We actually went out to his place in Seattle. We went to his home. We went to his office. We saw him, with some frequency after he acquired the Post. And then there were regular check-ins, typically every 2 weeks, by teleconference. So, he mainly focused on, the kinds of initiatives that we were funding in journalism, not the content of the journalism, but the actual, the kinds of approaches that we were taking, and the positions that we were funding. And because we had to come up with a budget right away, he acquired the deal closed in October 1st of 2013, and we had a budget for 2014 that we had to come up with. And but mostly he focused on the technology, focused on the marketing, he focused on testing that we do on site. He focused on a lot of the business, a lot of the pricing, things like that, introductory offers, how to structure them, the actual language, the details of the language, the model that we came up with, all of that stuff. I mean, he was deeply involved in all of that. Over time, the interactions became less frequent. They were we tried to keep the rhythm of a meeting once every 2 weeks. That kind of, it kind of fell away a bit, and maybe it was once a month. They may be back to once every 2 weeks now. I'm not sure. He was fairly preoccupied with some other things at one point, as you may recall. And so that's been the relationship. He doesn't visit the office very often at all. He's been in Washington many times where he doesn't come in.
If you were writing a story about him based on your experience with him, what would the thrust of the story and maybe even the lead be?
He's a very unconventional thinker. He does not, I mean, that should be evident. That's how he came up with Amazon in the first place. If he had thought conventionally, he wouldn't have come up with Amazon. He would have been Barnes and Noble. I mean, I think that he's just, I think that there are a lot of people in the industry who think along the same lines, and he's not one who does that. He's also an incredibly long-term thinker. And, he's the first person, I've ever heard talk about what we're going to be in 20 years. I mean, when I first heard him say 20 years, I practically fell to the floor because I've never heard the term 20 years. I was used to hearing, next quarter, next year, something like that, at best next year. So, maybe a 3-year plan or something like that, but you knew the 3-year plan wasn't going to be the plan. But he thinks in terms of 20 years. And so, and I think that's great. I think that's one thing that our industry needs.
When these quote unquote other things that he was preoccupied with came up, are you saying that the Post's approach to those stories was completely uninhibited? And in fact, did you have any more or less access to him than competing publications would have had with respect to his marital situation and all of that?
We had no special access. We gave him no special treatment. We did it the way anybody else would have done, and that's how we approached it. And that remains the case as far as I know. Okay.
I wanted to ask you what you thought about these recent incidents at the New York Times, where in one case, an editorial page editor was removed after an op-ed he ran. In another case, a reporter was pressured to resign or was forced to resign as a result of an incident involving language, and with all the complications that arose there. So, what was your view as a journalist?
Not sure I want to get into the New York Times' controversies, to tell you the truth. I've had plenty of my own to deal with. So I don't know. Look, I mean, I would talk in terms of broader principle, and that is that with respect to the op-ed page, I think that op-ed pages should have a wide variety of opinion. That's basically what I believe. I mean, I think there are some boundaries, but I think that the op-ed page should cover a wide territory. And that's what I want to see in an op-ed page. That's the whole idea. I mean, I've been around long enough that I remember when op-ed pages were invented. And the idea was that they were opposite the editorial page, and the idea that there would be opinions that would actually contradict what you saw on the editorial page, that they wouldn't necessarily be the same. So I'm in favor of a wide variety of opinion. So, and with respect to the reporting situation and the use of language, I don't know enough about it, and I just don't have enough information about it.
What brought you to the field of journalism to begin with, Marty? Did you go to college with becoming a journalist in mind, or were you one of those that rejected law school in favor of journalism?
My mother would have liked me to go to law school, and after I started in journalism, she suggested that I might want to think about it, but I didn't. I wasn't interested. So I don't know exactly. I mean, I think that it's because my parents were immigrants to the United States. They came from there. My mother was born in what was then Palestine, but became Israel, and my father went from Germany to Israel and then Palestine in 1937. And from Germany, and came to the United States. First, they stopped over in France, and then the United States. And they were keenly interested in what was happening in the news, what was happening around the world, and what was happening in this country they had come to. And we had a daily newspaper habit, the local newspaper in Tampa, Florida, where I grew up. And they watched the nightly news, the Huntley Brinkley report way back when, and then the local news as well. And then we got Time magazine every week. And my father got a bunch of other things like foreign affairs and things like that because he was in the export business. And so it was just part of the routine, and I was interested in it. I was interested in public affairs, and that was a way to be involved. And when I went to college, it was something that I was seriously considering, I was thinking about doing. I had been editor of my high school newspaper, and I started working on the college newspaper, but I wasn't sure, and so I decided to get an MBA as well, just in case the journalism thing didn't work out. And I also knew that journalism was becoming more specialized and that it would be helpful to have a specialty. I knew enough about the field at the time that I could feel that. And so I figured I better study something.
What was your undergraduate degree in?
Journalism. Yeah, journalism.
Okay.
At Lehigh University, where I went, at the time, it was a division of the English department. There were only 2 professors when I first went there. And they've grown since a fair amount. But there were only 2 professors, and so it was super small.
So you started at the Herald. Did you have a mentor there who brought you up through the ranks?
Well, I didn't stay long enough to be brought up through the ranks. So
right.
I was there. I stayed there for 3 years as a reporter, and I started in a small town called Stewart, which at the time had 12,000 people and 50,000 in the entire county. And then I went to Boca Raton. I worked in Boca Raton. There was a Boca Raton Delray Beach Bureau where I worked with Barry Barack, New York Times reporter, became a New York Times reporter. We worked together there. And then I went to Miami to be a business reporter. And I left in 1979 to go to the LA Times, where I was for 17 years. So, and then the Times hired me from the LA Times in 1996.
You didn't stay too long that second time at the Times.
No, I didn't.
What lures you away?
First was that I had the opportunity to be the editor of a major metropolitan newspaper, and I had wanted to do that. By then I'd been editor of my high school newspaper, editor of my college newspaper, and at the LA Times I ran their edition in Orange County, just south of LA. Which at the time had 165 people in it, and it was like running your own newspaper. And so I was really keen to do that. And then I was in this very difficult job of being the night editor at the New York Times, where you're kind of the last word on everything, and nobody wants to hear the last word. So a tremendous amount of stress. And I was working for for Joe Lelyveld and I think Arthur was on here, I saw him. And Joe needed, the New York Times was becoming a national newspaper at that time. They started the national edition. They needed to change the editions. Initially, it was every half hour between the city edition and the regional edition and the national edition. They, when the copy desk complained, they changed it to every 45 minutes. It was a brutal grind, starting at about 3 p.m. till whenever in the morning. And you found yourself constantly, telling people that they needed to do something, and people at that hour, at those late hours, didn't necessarily want to do it. But I always knew that I was going to confront Joe the next day unless we did it. So, and also my own sense as to what was the right thing to do. So it was a pretty stressful job, and not exactly the best one for making friends, and also didn't allow for much of a life outside of work. And then I had this incredible opportunity to become editor of the Miami Herald, and it was a place that I knew. I had worked in Miami. I grew up in Florida. I spoke Spanish. Speak Spanish. And so I was really interested in Latin America and had spent a fair amount of time there on my own. And so, it was a great opportunity for me.
You were talking about Jeff Bezos thinking about what newspapers would be like, or what the Post would be like in 20 years. So I was wondering what you think they'll be like in 20 years, or not just the Post, but other newspapers. And what did he say? What did Jeff say?
Jeff has talked about us having 10 million digital subscribers and even 100 million. So you could call that pretty ambitious, given that the Post now has 3 million, which is great, but it's less than the New York Times. And it's some of the New York Times subscribers sort of the crossword puzzle and cooking and things like that. But the core news subscribers is still much larger, at least double of what the New York Times, what the Washington Post has. I think that's possible. I think that's entirely possible for them.
Well, did he think it would be all digital?
Yeah, it will be all digital. There's no question.
Yeah, okay,
that it'll be all digital.
Right,
He doesn't. Yeah. I don't think he holds out much hope. He's talked about the newspaper as being something like, he said this in an interview. It'll be like you're owning a horse. It'll be like, it's like a luxury item. People will look at it. They'll be looking at a newspaper on the coffee table, and somebody will come in and say, young person will say, "What's that?" And you'll have to explain to them what it is. It's just not. Look, that's just not the way that people live their lives. It's not how people get information. It's just like, a little hard to talk about print when we're sitting here on a Zoom call. We're having, we're taking advantage of a technology that didn't exist just a few years ago. This is the way that people get their information. So I think he envisions that the Post will be much larger, that at some point it'll get to 10 million subscribers domestically and internationally, and that he'll continue to invest. And I think he's very proud of his ownership. He said that. I believe him. I think that he sees real opportunity for the Post.
And do you agree with that? Or do you have a different vision?
I don't have a different vision. I think it's possible. I don't think it's easy. Nothing in this business is easy. I do think it's entirely possible. And when you look at that, we acquired 3 million digital subscribers. We only started with the Post started its paywall 6 months after I arrived, well after the New York Times, years after the New York Times. It was not, as I recall, it was not an easy decision even for the New York Times, and many people criticized the New York Times at the time that they implemented the paywall, said it wasn't going to work. You may remember the phrase, "the information wants to be free." Nobody interviewed information. It turns out that we can actually charge for information. So we implemented the paywall in 2013. Things really accelerated, obviously, with Donald Trump coming on the scene during his campaign, and then during the administration as well. I think it'll be a harder slog than it has been because of that. I don't think that we have that sort of, because Donald Trump is not on the scene in the same way that he was. He's still around, obviously, controls the Republican Party, but I think there's real opportunity for the Post over the long run.
And what about the smaller papers? Somewhat smaller papers that are still around.
That's the biggest crisis in American journalism. I don't think we can lose hope because, there was a time where people were talking about the Washington Post going out of business. There were people talking about the New York Times going out of business, I was there when the stock went from, I observed as the stock went from like $50 a share to $3.50 a share. Some of you may be familiar with that. It took some financial assistance from Carlos Slim in Mexico, and people were predicting that the Times would go bankrupt. It didn't. It turned around. It's highly successful. It's great to see. It's great for this country. So I don't think we should despair about local journalism, but it is hugely difficult. It cannot acquire the kind of scale that the Washington Post has now acquired, or that the New York Times already had at a national or even international level. And you don't inspire the same sort of passion that you do about what's happening in national politics. And so it's just hard to get as excited about what's happening on the city council as it is to get excited about Donald Trump. I do think there's some promising models out there, and there's some evidence that there can be success, and I'm happy to see that. that's something that we really have to work on figuring out, and something that I want to spend some time on in my retirement is trying to figure that out and trying to be helpful in that regard if I can be. I do think they have to charge.
Can you talk about whether you consider the challenge of covering the Israeli-Palestinian story to be particularly acute? And how did you feel? And this is a question that Alan Dodds-Frank wanted us to ask about. What's your feeling about the Israelis blowing up the building in Gaza?
You mean the AP building?
Yeah.
Look, I think that's terrible. I mean, I think that's really terrible. I think there's an obligation on the part of the Israelis to demonstrate that there was some real rationale for doing so, not just declaring it to have been an intelligence center for Hamas. So, I mean, you can't just say it. I think you have to prove it, and they haven't done anything of the sort. And I suspect they won't. In terms of coverage, I mean, I don't know what's your specific question about coverage, though, David?
Oh, well, whether or not you hear from all kinds of parties about it, whether or not it's particularly sensitive to cover given the scrutiny that your readers and apply to it. The particular challenges of covering that beat fairly.
Well, I think it is. I mean, I think people have very strong opinions about that part of the world, and you certainly hear from all sides. I mean, I've heard from Jewish groups. I've heard from Arab groups, Arab American groups. I've sat down with all of them, and I've been accused of being everything: anti-Semitic, anti-Palestinian. Look, I mean, I think we have to make sure that we just have good quality journalists there, people who have integrity and who are going to be serious about their work. Using our standards, we believe are being thorough and fair and rigorous in everything that they're doing. And if we're satisfied with that, then we just publish what they observe. And if there are criticisms, and I was always willing to listen to them, but I very rarely agreed with them. It's a tough one. I mean, but every subject is tough these days. I mean, covering American politics is tough. You take a lot of abuse just for that, and that's just the nature of the business these days.
You taken personal abuse because you're Jewish?
Sometimes, yeah, even by Jewish groups who I think that I should.
You're too pro-Palestinian.
Right, that I'm right. I'm sort of self-hating Jew or something because of our coverage of the Middle East. But anyway, I mean, look, you find a wide range of coverage in Israel itself of what's happening within Israel than sometimes you find even within the American press.
I asked a tough question about pandemic coverage, but I must say the Washington Post has probably done the best job of on this issue of any that I've seen, certainly a lot better than the New York Times, which politicized it. But the question is this: do you think that, going back to Donald Trump, that his absolute insanity, his anti-science position of touting drinking bleach and pushing a drug that didn't have data behind it, and created Fauci almost a god in media circles, has made the major media inclined to not ask tough questions that it might have otherwise asked about the people at the top making decisions about what treatment there is in the middle of a pandemic. And I say this because I have been working with a bunch of doctors who treat patients, not doctors in labs and in offices who make those decisions, but doctors in critical care situations. And I've been interviewing people from around the world, patients and doctors. And they know that there are existing drugs that are very powerful antivirals that can end this pandemic. It's happening in India right now as some of the states are using one of these drugs. It has happened in Zimbabwe, in South Africa, in Argentina, in Mexico City, but it has not been covered by the mainstream media, and it has been censored online in this country as misinformation, when in fact it's coming from real doctors who know what they're doing, who have proper degrees, and say, for God's sake, where is the media on this? Why are we being politicized? People are dying because of this. And it's very disturbing to people who've interviewed people who've turned around when they've been able to get a certain drug. That's it. What do you say about?
I'd have to know more about what you're referring to. I mean, and I'm not an expert. I'm not a medical expert, and I'd have to talk to reporters who have covered this and really understand which treatments you're talking about. I'm not familiar with those treatments that you're saying would be successful. I myself have the husband of a relative of mine is an infectious disease specialist in South Miami. He has been, I mean, obviously that place was a state of crisis early in the pandemic, and they had a first wave and then a second wave, and it was very risky for him, somebody who's my age and who has underlying conditions. He was about to retire. And he heads the infectious disease program at one of the hospitals, a hospital network in South Florida. He never mentioned to me any drugs that would be successful. He talked about treatments that might help mitigate sort of the people's conditions, but not that would be a cure, and like a vaccine would be. So I'm not familiar with those, and I really can't speak to that. I just don't know.
Well, one of the studies came out of Broward County, and it's ivermectin is the drug that's incredible, and it's just been dismissed. Anyway.
Marty, can I just ask you one more quick Trump question? Does part of you recoil when you come across the word lies? Trump lying, Trump's lies about this and that in the Times or the Post, or are you perfectly at peace with seeing that description of Trump's position in these papers?
I think it depends on the circumstances. I mean, it took us a while, obviously, to come around to that because that wasn't our custom to do that. And it also presumes that we know the state of mind of the president when he says something. I mean, does he know that what he's saying is untrue, or is he deluding himself? And there's, plenty of indications that on many occasions Trump is deluding himself. But there are also other occasions where he clearly knows that something is untrue, and yet he says it anyway, and that's a lie. So we came around to using that term. I do fear that we may use it too loosely, and we have to be really careful about that, because I think if we do, it dilutes the impact of it, and I think can make the reporting look. All we're trying to do is be adversarial, and that we're and that we've sort of become partisan. And so I think we have to be cautious about it. I think we can use it and should use it. And we've ended up having to use it more, and with some great frequency, but because there's a lot of evidence that he knows that what he's saying is untrue. But I still think we have to be careful with that.
The preferred phrase seems to be more neutral, which is without evidence. He claimed without evidence.
Yeah, well, it doesn't satisfy. I can tell you that doesn't satisfy the people who want us to use the word lie. The problem is that the people who want us to use the word lie, which is fine, somehow think it's going to be persuasive. It's not going to be persuasive to anybody. It doesn't. The people who believe that he's telling the truth are not going to be any more convinced if we use the word lie than if we don't. What's important for us is to demonstrate how things are untrue, and to really show that with evidence, to provide the evidence, the contrary evidence. And it's hard enough to get through to people with that. And I think we should be more focused on providing the contrary evidence and letting people see that, whether it's videos or original documents or audio or whatever it might be, rather than fixating over whether we use the word lie or use the word falsehood or without evidence.
Did you begin to use that term before or after the Times did? And how conscious would you be about, how often would you compare yourselves to the Times on questions like that?
We didn't use it until after the Times used it. I guess we were looking for an occasion where it was clearly evident that he knew what he was saying was false. If I recall correctly, it goes back to when Trump, we had run a story saying that Trump drafted his son Don Jr.'s statement about the meeting with the Russians that took place in Trump Tower during the campaign, and that Trump himself had drafted the statement about it. He flat out denied that. Called it fake news, what have you. He later testified under oath that he in his deposition that in fact he did draft it. So clearly that was a lie. I needed to be called a lie, and there've been other occasions like that.
Larry McShane of the Daily News, he's a reporter there. He wrote a column about a week or so ago. Please buy this newspaper. Do you think the Daily News can be saved? Its circulation, of course, is very low compared to the New York Post. What do you think?
I mean, I'm skeptical of anybody who says nothing can be saved, given that I've worked at places that said I worked at a place like the Washington Post that people were predicting almost couldn't be saved. And I worked at the New York Times, which at one time people were predicting would go bankrupt. So, you know, I mean, I think there is almost certainly room for a good, strong New York-centered news organization. I don't think the New York Times is really that. I mean, its focus is very much on what's happening around the country and around the world. And I don't think it's really viewed as a city newspaper. And its coverage would suggest that it isn't. And so, so I think there's room for that. Could the New York Daily News be that? Yeah, I think it could be. It would need the right leadership, and it would need the right investment, and it would need the right strategy. I'm not sure it has it right now. And columns that say, please buy this newspaper are nice. We all believe in that, but they're not effective. And I think we should recognize that a business strategy is more than please buy this newspaper. I mean, somebody who's a good business person needs to acquire the New York Daily News and develop the right strategy and implement it. And it's not, and to be honest, it's not going to be necessarily what the journalists think it should be. I mean, you know, it may actually upset some of the journalists who work there.
Which daily papers do you consider important enough to read every day now?
I read the Post, the Times, the Wall Street Journal. I look, you know, I look at the Boston Globe, given where I work. I look at my local newspaper where I'm living right now, and which is in Western Massachusetts, so the Berkshire Eagle. You know, there's a limit to what I can do in a day and do something else. So those are the ones that I read in addition to, you know, some magazines and things like that, like the New Yorker and the Atlantic and what have you.
Well, you had the incredible opportunity, as you said before, of doubling your staff. Did you find that there are ample people to pick and choose between? How would you consider the quality of the candidates that you weighed and what's out there now? And how hard was it to sift between all of them and hire so many people so quickly?
For most positions, we didn't have a real problem. We actually had far more candidates than we could possibly even evaluate. I mean, there were any number of positions where we had more than 100 people apply, maybe several hundred people apply for a position, and we had to sift through that. So I think the talent is quite good out there. There are areas where there are gaps, and I would say, you know, a good political coverage is some of it. There's some gaps within political coverage. There are also gaps in terms of foreign coverage. I mean, it used to be that, you know, a news organization like the Post, when they hired a foreign correspondent, it could be somebody that they hired from another news organization, whether it was the Baltimore Sun or the Chicago Tribune, the LA Times, the Miami Herald, the Boston Globe, all these papers that had foreign correspondents. Now, none of those papers have foreign correspondents. I mean, the LA Times still does, but far fewer. And so when you're looking for people who have foreign experiences, there are very few people to pick from. So the Post has really developed its own talent in that regard. It's got really great talent. It's also gone outside, but when we had positions coming open, we had a surfeit of candidates.
Marianne Rolnick asks, did you have a role in choosing your successor?
I did not have a role. I was asked at various times by the publisher my opinions on either individuals and also just the qualities that were needed for the job. And whenever he asked, I answered. That's it.
Let's finish by going back to your moment in the full sun, which was the Spotlight series at the Boston Globe, and which won the Pulitzer. Would you call that your most important investigative effort? Were you surprised at what you learned when you began probing this subject of priest abuse?
There are a lot of important things that have been done. I think the investigations of Donald Trump were very important. I felt the investigation of the NSA, based on the leaks of Edward Snowden, were very important. There have been other important investigations, but I would say that the Catholic Church investigation was the one that meant the most to me personally, simply because it had such a direct impact on ordinary people and people who had no power whatsoever, and people who were unable to grab the attention of law enforcement authorities, politicians, and the press. And so finally they were given the attention they deserved, and they were given the voice they deserved. And so that meant, I would say that meant the most to me. And it's the kind of institution, I mean, we all know that journalists are supposed to be investigating government, politics, but I think it's really important that we also investigate other powerful institutions in our society. And the Catholic Church was then the most powerful institution in Boston and in New England, not now, but it was then, and one of the most powerful in the world, and still is in many ways. And so I think it was important for us to, if we had evidence of wrongdoing, severe wrongdoing, that we needed to investigate it. And it was a clear, and what we found was a clear betrayal on the part of the church hierarchy, betrayal of the most faithful within the church, and a betrayal of their own principles. And so that set of stories, there were like 900 of them over time, that I would say that means the most to me. It was incredibly important, and it has had an enormous impact on how institutions deal with accusations of sexual abuse. It had an impact on how Penn State dealt with it. It has had an impact on how the Boy Scouts have dealt with it. I think it had, some impact on the Me Too movement. And it's an ongoing story because the church hasn't fully grappled with it as of today, even, so many 20 years later. So I would say in terms of what it meant to me, that meant the most.
Don't you think they should have let you, the movie makers should have let you play yourself rather than hire that crummy actor Shriver? Did you volunteer?
No, I don't actually. So look, he did a great job. And I think he would have liked a bigger role. It wasn't such a big role, but I guess it was a big presence, but not an actual big role, not a lot of speaking. So, I think he did a terrific job. And I mean, fortunately, I have friends who say that I actually have a sense of humor, which wasn't conveyed in that movie. So I'm really pleased and happy with those friends that they say that. It was a time where I probably did not exhibit much of a sense of humor because I was a newcomer to the Post, to the Globe, and to Boston. I was called an outsider, and I was treated like one, and I felt like one. And we launched that investigation right away. I fully understood what the implications of that might be, given how many Catholics live in Boston and New England, and also 6 weeks after I got to Boston, it was the attacks of 9/11, and so that was, as we all know, traumatic period. And we had the anthrax attacks as well. And it was not a cheerful time. So.
Well, now you have time in retirement to further develop your sense of humor, and
Hey, just watch for me on the comedy circuit. You watch.
We'll be looking for it. Well, Marty, thank you so much for spending some time with us. We are all journalists here, and we appreciate your contribution to our profession over 40 years, I guess. And we look forward to that memoir.
Okay, thanks. Be sure to buy it.
Thank you very much, Marty.
All right, thanks a lot. I appreciate it.
Thank you for doing this.